Hey everybody, Tim Parrish here for the Huntington Church of Christ. Welcome to Wednesday in the Word. A couple weeks ago, I received a message from someone who'd been viewing this program with us each week. And she said, I've got a request for somebody I'd like to hear you talk about because I've been fascinated by him for years. Well, even if I hadn't known the story, that would have been enough for me because I love a character who can grab someone's imagination and kind of hold it captive for a long time. Well, there's no doubt that this character we're going to talk about this evening will do just that for you. You will be equal parts confused and angry and sad and all kinds of things that go into this story. But I too, like you, Susan, have been fascinated by this story for a long time. I can remember asking some of my professors about this back when I was in graduate school because I thought surely those guys will have definitive answers to this question. Well, they didn't give me definitive answers. And I sent a message back this week and said, we're going to be talking about him, but you may not get the answers that you're looking for. This week, we're going to be spending some time with a man named Jephthah. Jephthah shows up for us in the book of Judges, chapter 11. I hope that you have at least some familiarity with the book of Judges as a whole, because it is a really unique glimpse into a really dark time in the history of God's people. In fact, sometimes I talk about it being kind of this roller coaster ride of deliverance from God, these mountaintop moments, followed by intense spiritual decline, followed by deliverance and decline and deliverance and decline. It just keeps happening over and over. And more than once in this book, we are confronted with this phrase that because there wasn't a king in Israel, or at least during the time that there wasn't a king, everybody just kind of did whatever they wanted to, whatever they thought was right. Each person kind of had their own standard of morality or appropriateness for life personally or in their community. And so it was a really, really bad time. Now, I think that kind of helps frame this story, whatever you end up doing with the conclusion of it, whatever you decided. I'm going to leave that kind of hanging out there. I'm not going to answer the question of exactly what does this mean. I want you to think about it. I want you to ponder on it. I want you to spend some time fascinated by the story. But understanding the darkness of the time in which this takes place is probably a really helpful thing, because even those people that we might sometimes elevate as the heroes of the book of Judges are not exactly heroic figures. Now, Jephthah is one of those guys who shows up in our New Testament 2 or 3 different times. In connection with teaching about the gospel and that kind of thing, but he also shows up in Hebrews chapter 11. You remember that chapter? We sometimes call that the Hall of Fame chapter. Preachers like to call it the Hall of Faith, kind of playing off that idea that this is a chapter that lists all the great heroes of the Old Testament. And so we'll talk in just a moment about the appropriateness in our mind of Jephthah's being included in that list. So let's just dive right in here, Judges chapter 11. I hope you have a Bible handy. And let's think about who this guy is and what is his fascinating story. Beginning in chapter 11, verse 1. Now Jephthah the Gileadite was a valiant warrior, but he was the son of a harlot. Boy, right off the bat, we just jump right in, don't we, with fascinating details. This guy, a valiant warrior, a man considered brave and strong, is also considered less than. Because while his dad's name is listed, Gilead, it just says his mom was a prostitute. And this is not a great beginning for anybody, is it? Because we know not only does this create some cultural issues, being an illegitimate son, this actually creates for Jephthah some spiritual concern. Because the law of Moses had made it clear that someone of illegitimate birth could not serve in the temple, couldn't serve in those ways. And so whatever else might happen with him, Jephthah's a little bit on the outside from the very beginning because his dad is named, but his mom is a prostitute. Now, this must have been an isolated moment in his dad's life. I don't want to try to defend him or defame him, either one. He's just here in the story, but the Bible says he marries and has other children with his wife. Now look at verse number 11, or verse number 2 rather, of chapter 11. And Gilead's wife bore him sons, and when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah out. And they said, you shall not have an inheritance in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman. So Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. This is not a great family story either, is it? You know, you have that one child who belongs to one of the parents, but not both of the parents. And I know a lot of families that really struggle with these issues today. The idea, well, you're not my sister, or you're not really my brother. You're not my mom. You're not my dad. That's pretty common stuff that a lot of families have to deal with today. Well, it happened in Jephthah's family too. His half-brothers said, you don't belong in this family. You might have been here, and we don't know the birth order. It's easy to assume he came first, but there's nothing that indicates that he did. Still, the thing that differentiates him is that his brothers are from one couple, and then you got Jephthah, the prostitute's son. And they said, look, whatever dad's going to leave, you don't get any of it. You don't belong to this family. You're not really our brother. You're not really even our father's son. Get out. So he does. But Jephthah, as a valiant warrior, possesses some leadership. We know that because what we find out next is there were some people who also were outcasts that kind of end up drawn to him. And they formed this little band, and whatever Bible you're reading from may offer you a different word here, but the New American Standard refers to the guys that kind of brought themselves out to him, that they were worthless fellows. Probably this means they had debts they couldn't pay. They got in trouble with whatever law structure there was. Maybe they too were questioned as far as whether they belonged in their families. And so they ended up drawn together by being outcasts. And it may even be in this setting that Jephthah really rises to the warrior status that there is. Now, verse 4 kind of skips ahead. It seems a number of years. I don't know exactly how many, but a number of years. And so we pick up in verse 4. And it came about after a while that the sons of Ammon came and fought against Israel. And when the sons of Ammon fought against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the land of Tob. They knew they needed a leader, and they knew they needed a man that was a valiant warrior. That's the way he was described. So they went out to get him, and they said, come, be our chief, that we can fight against the sons of Ammon. And then he said what we would all expect him to say. Are you kidding me? Don't you remember how you treated me? Don't you remember that I was there and you ran me off? Are you kidding right now? But he doesn't stop there. He says, if you take me back to fight against the sons of Ammon, and the Lord gives them up to me, then I'm going to be your head. I'm going to be your chief. I'm going to be your leader. And they said, the Lord as our witness? Yes. We need you. It's why we've come back out to you now. It's the reason that we've come, because we can't do this without you. What I don't find here is some statement of repentance. Any idea that they were sorry for what they had done, only that here they are and they want Jephthah to come and he says, okay, but it's going to cost you. And the guy that you didn't want to stay around anymore, the guy that you said was worthless and cast out, I'm going to be in charge. And you either accept that and get me, or you don't. And they said, we don't care. If you'll come and you'll be our leader. And so they agreed. And the people made him head and chief over all of them. And Jephthah spoke all his words before the Lord at Mizpah. This is verse 11. Now verse 12. Now Jephthah sent messengers to the king of the sons of Ammon, saying, what is it that you've come to fight for? Well, they tell him why they've come to fight, and he sends back word and says, we're not interested in those things. You got the facts wrong, and what you say is not true, and this is not a thing to fight over. But the Ammonites didn't listen to what Jephthah said. They really didn't care what Jephthah said. They wanted war. They wanted territory, and they were bloodthirsty. So they didn't listen. We pick up in verse 29. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, So that he passed through Gilead and Manasseh and Mizpah at Gilead, and from Mizpah of Gilead he went to the sons of Ammon. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will indeed give the sons of Ammon into my hand, then it shall be that whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the sons of Ammon, it shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering. So Jephthah crossed over to the sons of Ammon to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand. And he struck them with a very great slaughter from Aroer to the entrance of Minnith, 20 cities, as far as Abel-keramim. So the sons of Ammon were subdued before the sons of Israel. Now, if that's all we knew the story, we'd say, okay, this is a great story, not really fascinating. I mean, you got that human interest, the family drama, the dysfunction stuff that shows up there. But then he comes back in, everybody's fine with him being in charge, because when he comes back, he's filled with the Spirit of the Lord, and he wipes out, he subdues the enemy. He takes charge not only locally, but he takes charge of the enemies of these people. It's all good. This is what they wanted. And so there are some important details there. One is that as he was doing this, the Spirit of the Lord came on him. We don't need to miss that. We also don't need to miss the fact that whatever kind of man Jephthah was, he was a man who believed in the power of Yahweh enough that he knew the battle belonged to him, and that if he wanted to do this thing, it was going to take God in order to do it. He also believed that God was a God who could be bargained with. And I don't mean this in a bad way. I mean, this is a thing that's common throughout the Old Testament, particularly. People making vows with God and keeping those vows, and God being himself a vow keeper. High value placed on the idea of the keeping of vows. But that's where this story is about to really take a turn, because the specific terms of Jephthah's vow were that if he was victorious, that when he got home, he would make a burnt offering of whatever he saw first, of whatever came out of his house. Now, sometimes you may hear this called Jephthah's rash vow, because even if you're not familiar with the story, you think, well, what do you think is going to come out of your house when you get home? I mean, is it going to be your dog? Do you have sheep and goats in the house? A pet bird? What if it's your wife? What do you think is going to come out of your house? And that's why sometimes it's called rash, because it doesn't seem like he really thought that through very much. But I call you back to the idea of the time in which Jephthah is living. A time in which human life isn't really valued very highly, even among the people of God, who sometimes themselves have fallen into the practice of child sacrifice. That's what was common in the nations around them. And so this is not exactly a model place, a model society, and it is not today. It's not the present day. All right, so let's go back to our text and let's see what happens when Jephthah goes home. Verse 34. And when Jephthah came to his house at Mizpah, behold, his daughter was coming out to meet him with tambourines and dancing. Now she was his one and only child. Besides her, no son or daughter. And when he saw her, he tore his clothes. He said, Alas, my daughter, you've brought me very low, and you're among those who trouble me, for I have given my word to the Lord, and I can't take it back. Jephthah's rash vow. God, I will sacrifice as a burnt offering whatever comes out of my house first. And when he comes home, probably news of his victory had already reached home. His daughter comes out singing the victory song with tambourines in her hands, unaware of the vow her father had made. Now, when this happens, he is distraught. He tears his clothes. But notice what he says about his vow. He says, look, I made a vow, and I got to keep it. You don't not keep a vow you make to the Lord. And herein comes for me the great moral dilemma. Do I break my vow, or do I kill my daughter? And this becomes a very difficult thing for me to figure out. All right, let's go back to the text, because I want you to listen to the conversation that happens. So she said, verse 36, My father, you have given your word to the Lord. So do to me as you have said. because the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the sons of Ammon. But let this thing be done for me. Let me alone for 2 months, that I may go into the mountains and weep because of my virginity, I and my companions. Then he said, go. So he sent her away for 2 months, and she left with her companions and wept on the mountains because of her virginity. And at the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, who did to her according to the vow which he had made. And she had no relations with a man. Thus it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went yearly to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in the year. Now, this is not the end of the story of Gilead. There's a really interesting, or the story of Jephthah, rather. There's a really interesting story that happens next that even has to do with how you pronounce certain words. But for our study here, I want to stop here and ask the question, so did Jephthah kill his daughter? Well, that's the question that has been debated. Apparently, this really wasn't much debated until we get into about the 14th century. And then there were some people who began to struggle with this in a way that they offered an alternative explanation. But that alternative explanation has become quite compelling. So what I want to do is I want to give you 2 ideas and then just let you think about these. Okay? The first idea is that simply Jephthah made a vow to make a burnt offering of whatever, or in this case, whoever came out of the house. And when it says he did it, that means he took his daughter and he put her on an altar and he killed her and burned her body as a sacrifice to the Lord. Now, there's a lot of struggles in that for me. First of all, the idea that God would ever accept that kind of sacrifice. Well, I don't believe that to be true. Now, this brings to mind a story of what happened with Abraham and Isaac. God called on Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, but then he stopped him before he did it. And so maybe that casts a little bit of a shadow over this. But the idea, the law of God forbade human sacrifice. So do you see how these things really become a thing full of tension? That in order to be pleasing to God by keeping this vow, he has to murder his daughter and burn her body. It's just almost too much to comprehend. And yet, that is the simplest explanation. But the other idea is that rather than killing her and burning her body, that what Jephthah did was to dedicate her to the Lord in a way that might seem unusual to us, but it's as if he took her and put her as a gift in the keeping of the priests for a lifetime of service, a lifetime particularly of celibate service. And this is one of the reasons this comes into view is because of what she says in response. She doesn't say anything about dying or her father killing her. Instead, she says, let me go away with my friends and mourn the fact that I've never been with a man, that I'll never marry and have children, and that in essence, this is the end of Jephthah's family line. He has no other children but this one, and grandchildren are his hope of continuing his family line. But if his daughter is unable to ever have a child, whether she's dead or alive, that ends his family. And we're talking about a time in which there was tremendous value and worth given to a woman if she bore a child. Truth be told, this wasn't a time that valued women very highly otherwise. In fact, in our own story, Jephthah obviously came from a union with his father and a prostitute. No one joins himself to a prostitute who has a very high value or view of women. And yet here we are. I think about Rachel. Do you remember when Rachel is trying to find any way to have a child? Leah is having children. Rachel can't have a child. In Genesis chapter 30, she utters this phrase, "Give me children or I die." I think she thought that the only real purpose in life she had was if she could bear a child. And I think that comes into play here too, with the value given to a woman if she can bear a child, particularly to a man with no other children. It's certainly worth considering also that the custom that came to be a practice thing among the people of Israel, the women of Israel, was to go once a year and mourn not the death of Jephthah's daughter, but the perpetual virginity. The idea, again, that she's unable to bear a child for her father. And so there's a lot to wrestle with here. There are 2 or 3 things that I think are worth mentioning. First of all, we've already talked about the fact that Jephthah shows up in Hebrews chapter 11. And so some would argue against the idea of him using his daughter as a burnt offering, because they said, well, he couldn't be in chapter 11. Except there's some really interesting characters in chapter 11 who are guilty of all sorts of things, not the least of which might be David, who is guilty of quite possibly rape of Bathsheba, of the adulterous relationship, and then of the murder of her husband. So someone showing up in Hebrews chapter 11 doesn't mean that they're a morally perfect person or that they got everything right. It doesn't mean that they didn't possess faith or that they didn't, on the whole, stand out as people who were faithful to God. Still a little troubling though, isn't it? It's a little troubling and offending to our sensibilities. There's also the idea that the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah right before he made this vow. And so the argument is made, Jephthah could never have meant that he would kill his daughter, that he would offer her as a sacrifice in this way because the Spirit of the Lord was on him. And yet I could show you multiple examples throughout the Bible of the Spirit of the Lord being on someone who then does some really stupid thing or some really immoral thing despite the influence of the Spirit of the Lord. The Spirit of the Lord coming on someone did not suddenly make them morally perfect. It did not make them sinless. It did not even make them the wisest person so that it didn't make any really rash or foolish choices. So there is something maybe to consider there about the Spirit of the Lord. There's also an argument that the Bible never condemns Jephthah for this act. But I find it really troubling to try to build a spiritual argument from silence. Now, we've tried to do that sometimes. And I think sometimes those are our weakest moments of theological argument. When we start where the Bible just doesn't speak to something and we try to build a spiritual house around that. So the fact that the Bible doesn't expressly offer a condemnation of Jephthah, again, for me, it is not something that I think is worth considering. Now, what do we do with all this? How do we handle all this? Is it possible that the story of Jephthah ends with Jephthah killing his only daughter? Well, as hard for that is for me to imagine, I think we have to acknowledge that that is one very realistic possibility, that Jephthah's vow ends in this way. But is it possible that Jephthah took his daughter and put her into some kind of spiritual service in some kind of celibate place where she would live out the rest of her days as a single woman, never bearing a child? Well, I think that is a possibility. I don't know if there's precedent for that. I mean, you could argue the same thing happens with Hannah and Samuel when she takes Samuel to the prophet, to the priest Eli, and leaves him there in God's service. He was dedicated to the service of God. So maybe there is some precedent for that idea. But maybe I should really have gone here earlier. There is one text that I want us to consider that I think is worth mentioning here, because I think it offers a way out. It offers a way out for Jephthah so that he wouldn't have to kill his daughter, and maybe he wouldn't even have to offer her in this kind of service. I want to go to Leviticus chapter 5. In Leviticus chapter 5, I want to begin reading in verse number 4. Listen carefully for the story of Jephthah in these words. Or if a person swears thoughtlessly with his lips to do evil or to do good, in whatever a man may speak thoughtlessly with an oath, and it is hidden from him, and then he comes to know it, he will be guilty of one of these. And so it shall be when he becomes guilty in one of these that he shall confess that in which he has sinned. And he shall bring his offering to the Lord for his sin which he has committed, a female from the flock, a lamb or a goat as a sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement on behalf of his sin. But if he can't afford a lamb, he shall bring to the Lord his guilt offering for that in which he has sinned, 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, one for a sin offering, the other for a burnt offering. He shall bring them to the priest, who shall offer first that which is for the sin offering. He shall nip its head at the front of the neck, but he shall not sever it. He shall sprinkle some of the blood of the sin offering on the side of the altar, while the rest of the blood shall be drained out at the base. It is a sin offering. The second he shall prepare as a burnt offering according to the ordinance. So the priest shall make atonement on his behalf for the sin which he has committed, and it will be forgiven. But if his means are insufficient for 2 turtle doves or pigeons, then for his offering, for that which he has sinned, he shall bring the 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour for a sin offering. He shall not put oil on it or place incense on it. It is a sin offering. He shall bring it to the priest, and the priest shall take a handful of it as its memorial portion and offer it up in smoke on the altar with the offerings of the Lord by fire. It is a sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him concerning his sin which he has committed from one of these. It will be forgiven him, and the rest shall become the priest like grain offering. Now, what does this text have to do with Jephthah? This text in the law specifically says if somebody swears or makes a vow that's really foolish, really rash, really dumb, well, they are obligated for the keeping of a vow, and they don't just ignore it because they've sinned in what they've done, but there is a provision by the bringing of animals, or even by the bringing of flour if you can't afford animals. And so as I read the story of Jephthah, I think whatever he meant, if he meant he was going to burn as a burnt offering who or whatever came out, if that's not what he meant, if he meant something else, if he did kill his daughter as a burnt offering, or if he pledged her into a life of serving God in her virginity, either way, Jephthah, I think, if I'm not misinterpreting this text from Leviticus, he had a way out. He could have gone to the priest. He could have talked about his rash vow, and he could have agreed with the priest on how he would pay the price for his sin. So really the question for me becomes, however he handled it, why didn't Jephthah handle it this way? Instead of he and his daughter insisting that this vow had to be kept. Oh, there's lots of questions, and I'm afraid I've raised a few more. What is the value of a human life? What was human life so invaluable that this wasn't a big deal? Was it a big deal? Was the fact that she couldn't have a child such a big deal that it created this national 4-day period of mourning? There are just so many questions. But honestly, it goes back to this vow and the breaking of the vow and the keeping of the vow, and the fact that it seems like the law allowed, if he was familiar with the law, if the priests around him were familiar. But then I have to remind myself that we're talking about a time when the people of God even are pretty much morally bankrupt, and there's not a lot of emphasis or focus on the law of God or what the law says or keeping the law. So there's a lot of questions in my mind, and I still continue to be fascinated by the story of Jephthah. I'm struggling even to come up with great practical application for this story. Maybe be careful what we vow, maybe be careful what we promise, maybe value the people in our lives. There's all kinds of things maybe that you could come up with, and yet none of them seem to fit perfectly, none of those lessons. And so instead of trying to just moralize the story, maybe we just let it sit there. And maybe we consider that this is the kind of thing that happens when everyone does what's right in his own eyes. Thanks for stopping by.